Dan, I'd like to jump right in. I talked a little bit about best practices to start us off. So what literally have you seen or experienced in terms of best practices in solving this so-called talent puzzle?
Yeah, the fourth industrial revolution is making this talent puzzle even more complex in what we're facing today. So what we're seeing is that LinkedIn is in a unique position to provide data and insights to companies on skills that we are beginning to see that companies are in demand of. Okay. So skills like artificial intelligence, big data, cloud computing, these are top skills that companies are looking for. And interestingly, we are seeing soft skills that is going to play a vital role in this AI and automation world. Mm-hmm. And such soft skills is going to be critical. Things like creativity, problem solving, critical problem solving skills, those are skills that is soft skills and is going to be in great demand as well. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing companies really demonstrating that apart from just looking for the hard skills, they're also looking for the soft skills. And best practices that companies has is really just making sure that they not just look at upskilling their people, but setting an example as providing that learning opportunities for their talent.
Well, I'm glad to know that artificial intelligence is on the front burner, but I'm also glad to know that we still need some soft skills so human beings are not on the back burner. Alicia, a lot of people say it's a pipeline issue. Is it simply a pipeline problem, or do we really need to just change the way we think about how we hire and develop talent?
So I think the short answer is absolutely a pipeline issue, because when companies look for CEOs or C-suite leaders, often, surprisingly, often it is quite reactive. You know, the CEO could be 70 years old, but they never thought about the succession planning and building the pipeline for it. And so what we are asking companies to do, what we've been working on, is really very systematically build a pipeline and a process that really considers women and other diverse talent equally. And so absolutely it's a pipeline. And if you look at it for pure mathematical, statistical ways, if your top global leaders are all men, you absolutely cannot claim that you have the best leadership. I mean, it's just simply not possible. And women bring a lot of great qualities and competencies and some traits and drivers that are slightly different than men. And I think if you really want to have a best leadership team, you have to have a diversity in your leadership.
And you have to start growing that at the middle level so that they can achieve executive levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are various ways you can assess for potential. Now it's quite proven. We have tools, as well as many other companies. So you can actually take the middle management tool and find those high potentials, but then really invest in developing them and giving them experiences that will bring them to the global leadership roles. Because having potential is not enough. You still have to have a crucible experiences and challenges and travel the world and everything else to become a global leader. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes women are overlooked, or they don't push themselves hard enough to prepare them to be great CEOs and global leaders.
And that actually moves me to the question that I wanted to put to Emmanuel. The description of his panel actually focuses on how to fill those talent gaps, exploring the whole issue of mobility, how and where people move for work. But you and I have talked about this a little earlier, the human factor. There's some real reasons people do move for work, and then there's some reasons that people don't. Help me explore that.
Yes, thank you, Star. Maybe before I talk about the human factor, something on the pipeline. following up on what Alicia said, and we heard earlier this afternoon this very common excuse that we hear all the time: "Oh, I cannot recruit women because I cannot find good candidates, and they don't fit the position." And I think there are several answers to that excuse. We heard one earlier this afternoon, which is, well, look again. And if you really look for a candidate, you will find a candidate that fits the job. So that's one of the answers. I think there's a second one, which might be to look at this candidate differently and to realize that even if a particular candidate doesn't necessarily fit the perfect job description, that candidate could actually still good for the job and actually might be able to do better. And you know, I'm a lawyer. I work in a law firm, and especially big international law firms, we have a tendency to only hire the same type of candidates coming from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, you name it. But why don't we hire different profiles? Why don't we take, let's call it a risk, and hire different candidates? And I have an anecdote here. A few years ago in my law firm, we hired a young lady who was not a lawyer, she was an engineer, and she was doing trading in oil and gas, and she wanted to become a lawyer. And I think she might have had difficulties being hired by other international law firms, but we decided to hire her just because she convinced us. And we allowed us to work at the law firm and at the same time pass the bar exam. And what's the result of that? Well, number one, she got the bar exam. She became a lawyer. She was a truly excellent lawyer. And now that we're talking about mobility, last year, she relocated from France to Houston, Texas, where she's helping developing our oil and gas practice. So that's the best practice, I think, to solve the talent puzzle as we.
It's an example of, if you want different fish to eat, stop fishing in the same pond.
Absolutely, absolutely. And talking about the human factor, it is true that traditionally companies look at this problem of talent puzzle from a business needs perspective, or in other words, they identify the gaps in their curriculum, in their workforce, and then they look for people to fill the gaps. But another way of looking at the problem is to actually look at people themselves and ask them why they want to move or why they don't want to move. And when you do that, you realize, and I think empirical studies show it, that increasingly people want to move not because they found a job opportunity, not because they asked to do so, but simply because they want to move. And personally, that was my case. I moved from Paris to Singapore 10 years ago, then from Singapore to Taiwan, then Hong Kong. Now I'm between Beijing and Singapore. And the reason why I moved to Singapore is not because the firm offered me to move to Singapore, but just because I wanted to. And the firm was clever enough to accommodate my request. And I can say that in this room, I have at least 3 colleagues who respectively relocated from New York, from London, and from Paris to Singapore, not because the firm wanted them to relocate, but because they wanted to relocate. And again, the firm accommodated that request. In other words, it's not so much a question of moving people to the job, but to moving people where they want to go, and then move the job to the people. And by doing that, you retain talent. Instead of filling the gaps, you just prevent the gaps from being created in the first place.
Makes complete sense. Shireen, as I listen to some of these best practices and solutions, I think with your oversight responsibilities, you have a big picture view on what organizations can actually do to create a more inclusive culture, because it's not just about externally bringing in diverse individuals, it's about internally making a culture that is conducive to everyone feeling comfortable and a valued part of the team.
Thank you, Star. I think that when you look at the terms inclusive culture, you can't move away from companies being profitable. I think this is, the starting point for all companies. And when I take myself out of my current role as chair of the stock exchange, but looking back when I was a fund manager, in 2011, after running money for 20 plus years, we did a quite extensive research project, and we covered 3,054 companies in Southeast Asia, looking at the performances of these companies and those companies which had women on the boards and women in management. And at that time, I used to have a column which I used to write in the newspaper. And what I did is I wrote about our research in the newspaper, showing the politicians, administrators, that we need to have women, or diversity, not just women, but different backgrounds on boards because it makes sense. At that time, I think it was March 2011, the minister then read my column and said we need to make change. So they started to implement a policy. I know there was a lot of pushback because a lot of people don't believe in having targets, even if they're soft targets. But it was the only way to get an inclusive culture started. It was the only way. And I know many successful women have been quite cross with me and said, you know, must be based on meritocracy. But the thing is that if we don't have a push factor, I could see by visiting all these companies, I've been to thousands of AGMs, there are never any women in those days sitting on the board. You know, you would just see only men. So once we could see that, and there was this change, again, a lot of men were complaining. They went to the politicians to say, you know, this is not fair. Now we're not going to have the roles, you're giving it to women. So fast forward, a lot of countries in the region now have some sort of soft target. Now, I'm trying to put in something which would determine the type of directors you could have. And because whatever you say, whenever you look at profiles of people coming in, it's not inclusive. What it is it looks at people and they will say, oh, another woman? You know, it just keeps happening. I mean, even where I sit today and what I see, it is that same topic. If we start having criteria for how skill sets are chosen, and we take the gender out and it's just skill driven and it becomes a rule of sorts when you pick boards, I think this is going to be my next level of how to push change. I haven't got there yet, but I'm pushing for it because I think this is how we're going to get the inclusive nature. And the other thing is, of course, when companies who have women on boards or women chairs or women CEOs who do well and they're profitable, other people want to join them. And then the whole culture will start to change. But again, it's everybody moving forward together to make this change. Otherwise, it'll never get to the real levels or the levels that we want to see it at.
You've addressed literally the elephant in the room and the core foundation of the diversity and inclusion issue, which is unconscious bias. If the people who are making the decision around the table walk in with a bias, be it conscious or unconscious, it filters into the decision making. So I look to you, Fionn, to follow up on what Shireen was just saying. There's no doubt about the contributions that Asian women make and how critical they are. Why are we still having this argument right now?
Yeah, I was just smiling when Shireen was making the comments about words that is being used to describe skill sets and what Emmanuel just mentioned about job description, because in the latest LinkedIn research shows that 60% of the hiring managers agree that diversity is important, but yet less than 25% of the people make a conscious effort about making sure that their job description or their job advertisements are less biased. And, you know, in it itself, the job description is biased. You know, when a woman likes to be talking about words that is a lot more performance-based, like, you know, being seen as result-oriented, hardworking. But women also have a tendency to like to be seen as likable. They like to be seen as, I'm very supportive, I want to create a very inclusive environment. But that's not the words that normally is being seen as, oh, that's what I'm looking for. So
that's not the action sexy word that the hiring manager is looking for. Well, Fionn, you have been, I'm sorry, Alicia, you actually have worked in that search area. Yeah. And I always want to ask, I was going to ask it later on, but this is the right time. Everyone wants to know, what's the secret sauce? What is the key words. How do you walk in there and actually make yourself attractive as a candidate?
Yeah, so I'm just going to assume that anybody that's being considered for a role has the right experiences, but that is very important. But apart from that, certainly for me, what I look for is a positive energy. Leaders have to be positive, optimistic. If I interview a senior executive or potential CEO, and I walk out of the room after an hour, exhausted and wanting to jump out of the room, that's not a good sign, right? But when I meet great leaders, often I'm energized by the conversation, by the optimism, by the positivity. So I guess that's the X factor that we all look for above and beyond the CV and the experiences.
You walk in thinking, okay, if you're at least in front of me, you have the foundation of the qualifications. So now let's see if you have that secret sauce. That's where it comes down to.
Yeah, that's right. And it has a lot to do with your interpersonal skills, your perspective, your confidence. And often women have this assumption or operate with this assumption that if I just work really, really hard, I will be recognized, I will be promoted, I will get that job. But I will tell you, that's not the case. And you do have to ask for it. These are really competitive situations to move up to the very C-suite. And you have to prepare yourself, you have to challenge yourself throughout your career if you want to be considered for a CEO role. So I think it's that determination, that ownership of your own career is very, very important factor.
Shireen, I'd like to follow up on your plans that you're putting in place right now. I know that quota is the bad word. No one wants, sometimes we now say targets. But what are your views on creating a real succession plan? Because it's something that Alicia actually pointed out when she first made comments. The pipeline needs to have talented, strong, diverse candidates in the succession plan of any successful corporation.
So if I can just go back to my story, where once it got approved at government level, the government at the time did allocate 50 million ringgit at the time, which is about 12 million US, to training women so they could be prepared for the board. And to my complete horror, the decision of those people who are awarded the contracts to train women only wanted to train women above the age of 45. And I felt that that was completely losing the plot, because you're not going to have the succession moving up. One of the solutions that I have suggested to various groups is that C-2, C-3, put those women on unlisted or subsidiary boards or put them on foundations just to allow them to get into that experience of being a board member. Because being a board member is not about attending a course, but unfortunately for women, if you have not got any board experience, you have to have attended a course. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it is what it is. So when I see many companies where they don't allow women to participate at any board level or any committee level, then you know that company really has a lot to learn. Because, and even when you're analyzing companies, you know, there are many companies where you can just look at the screen of the top management. If there are no women there, I tell other women, don't join that company. Don't try and change them. They're not going to change. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your life. Go to people who are inclusive already. Then you join them, then you make change. Because if you go into a company when you're on your own, you're just going to be earmarked. You're going to be pigeonholed. You're not going to be able to do what you really want to do.
It starts with recognizing that doing an uphill climb is a whole heck of a lot more difficult.
Yes.
And I hear what you're saying. Manuel, there are a lot of changes that have occurred across the globe legally that are pushing for board parity, board equity. What have you seen in terms of the pushback from a legal perspective? You're our resident lawyer here.
Yes, I mean, legal issues are indeed very broad in relation to mobility.
Yes.
So I'm not a resident lawyer in Singapore. I'm not qualified in Singapore, so I'm not sure I'm the best place to talk about the reaction to these issues in Singapore. But
in general, I know the United States has been slow. I'll give you a real example. The United States has been slow in terms of our states making policy that says there needs to be board equity, gender equity. We have been slow behind Europe because Europe has been moving much quicker. Where does the law stand across the board is really where I'm talking about.
So what I can talk about is the country where I come from, where I'm qualified to practice, which
Excellent.
is France, and you heard
Yes.
the example we had this morning. France went further than just
Yes.
parity in boards, since the government has just enacted a law that provides for effective parity in salaries in company. So that's something that is exceptional to France, which you won't find in other countries. Now, when we talk about legal issues, we can probably consider this as quite advanced, but I think we should not forget that in many countries in the world today, men and women are still not created equal before the law. And since we talk about mobility today, this report from the World Bank, Women, Business and the Law, shows that as far as mobility is concerned, in 30 countries, in 30% of the countries in the world, men and women still do not have the same right of freedom of movement. If you look at Iran, for example, women cannot choose their home like a man. They cannot choose to leave their home like a man. They cannot apply for a passport like a man can do it. And they cannot exit the country like a man. So fortunately, we have these examples of law coming to promote inclusion and diversity, France being a good example, but you have other examples in Asia, laws that prohibit discrimination on gender, laws that prohibit inequality of salaries for work of the same value. But the problem is that you won't find these laws everywhere. And second, when you do find these laws, it's difficult to enforce them. How do you prove before a court that you've been discriminated on the basis exclusively of your gender? It's very difficult to prove. And that's the reason why the case law is so rare in these matters. But fortunately, you do find some case law. In France, there are some cases where women indeed convinced the court and obtained judgment to recognize that they were discriminated solely on the basis of the fact that they were women. So I think there's hope here, but there's still a lot to do in many countries, including in Asia.
And I would actually like to put out to the panel, the whole concept of diversity and inclusion is hollow if we don't deal with the issue of pay equity. Unless we finally close that gap, we're going to continue in this cycle where women are not going to be seated at the table at the same levels. Alicia, Shireen, I see you both nodding your head.
Well, I think that, before we can even start to have people at the table where we're respected, because one of the big issues I've seen, and I'm so frustrated with it, is many companies still to this day manage or have the leadership style of with favor and with fear. I mean, it's so evident. And when you're female and you're moving up the ranks, in the various times of my life, I've always seemed to get these anonymous letters or young women calling me for help. And again, it's, whether their boss wants to have a karaoke session with them, and if they don't go, they won't get promoted. All these things that are just, so grossly unfair. But then they'd never dare actually file a formal report. I mean, this #MeToo, I think, has liberated so many women. And, 25 years ago, when I was in, my previous organization, the number of young women who were treated poorly or were biased against, you don't even want to talk about salary. Promotion and salary would never be on the cards for them, ever. So, we have a lot to do. Otherwise our grandchildren are going to be sitting on this panel having the same conversation. because the change is so slow.
We need to do a hashtag pay me fairly, because
Yeah.
hashtag me too doesn't matter if you can't afford to take care of your family the exact way a man would take care of your family. Alicia?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this this era of Me Too movement. I think it absolutely helps now if you have female leaders at the top,
Yes.
because it shows your social contract, that you're committed to it, that you stand for equality. So I think we're moving towards the right direction. But in terms of the pay equity, I think the biggest problem and the challenge is exactly what Emmanuel pointed out. It's very, very difficult to analyze and prove that there has been discrimination on pay, because oftentimes you don't know what your peers are paid. And not only that, you could make so many arguments, and there are so many factors that go into a pay decision. So I think it is harder to implement than one would think about equal pay. But I will say this, from an individual standpoint, women negotiate less hard.
Yes.
That is just absolutely my experience as an executive search partner for the last 17 years.
To what do you attribute that?
I think a couple things. I do think men have a higher level of entitlement. Must be nice, Emmanuel. And I also think there is a societal aspect where men are expected to be the breadwinner of the family, and therefore, organizationally, unconsciously, we expect to take care of our male leaders better.
You know, it's interesting that you point that out, because there's been a study that when a woman goes in to her leader and says that she is thinking about having a family, that leader hears, I'm not going to have her full time, I'm not going to have her attention. But when a man goes in and says he's thinking about having a family, that leader hears, this is someone I can depend on, he is going to need to take care of his family. So it's the exact opposite with the same premise.
I agree. And interestingly, last year at this conference, I spoke about the findings from the CEO Women Speak, where we interviewed 57 Fortune 500 CEOs who are female, and how kind of they made it to the top, despite all this. And in terms of their innate or their driver, so we did a psychometric test on their motivation and driver. And interestingly, 2/3 of the women who are CEOs, they were driven by the sense of purpose. That's very different than male CEOs, who are often driven by power and money. So that could be another reason why women tend to get paid less for the same job. But I think the sense of purpose, creating the community, team orientation was super important. Another important distinction that came out of that study is that women CEOs came out slightly less on confidence and high on humility. And what we learned from doing a behavior interviews to kind of supplement the psychometric testing we've done is that actually women exude confidence in a slightly different way than men. Right? We tend to beat our chest a little bit less, and it's less about me and I, but giving credit to the team. So sometimes that comes across as being less confident and having higher humility. But frankly, those are the qualities and leadership traits that the millennials and the following generations or the younger generations are requesting or requiring of leaders. So I think women's natural traits have a very strong place in the future leadership role around the world, in every sector.
Fionn, what is your company, LinkedIn, doing to nurture globally minded talent and inclusiveness? I know that so many of us have our present job and are looking for our next job via LinkedIn. So it's become a part of our culture.
Yeah, I was just listening to Alicia, and I was really interested with what she just mentioned about pay equality, and really think that it starts from the top. I absolutely believe that if there aren't that many women in the first place, it's kind of difficult to be very conscious about what matters to a woman. If there's more women at the top, then it also consciously helps to address some of the challenges that organizations have facing in terms of the lack of diversity. So in LinkedIn itself, for the past 4 years, we've been very conscious about grooming women leaders. And, you know, right now we are seeing a 66% increase in women in leadership roles across our global sales organizations, and 3 times more leaders in our technical roles. So with that sustained effort, it's not just a point in time, like, oh, this is going to be important right now. It's really a sustaining effort that we are seeing that makes a lot of difference. The second thing is to build an inclusive culture is to be very conscious about how you actually solicit feedback. You know, research has found that when employees feel that their leaders listen to their feedback and take actions, they are a lot more engaged. And organizations can begin to be very conscious about what they can do about their employees' feedback.
And did you want to say something, Alicia?
Yeah, I just want to just kind of add on that point, which is kind of sponsorship from the top and the commitment from the top. We at Korn Ferry, we have a women's leadership program called Accelerating Women Exponentially. And it's a very good leadership development program that's designed for women. But as a firm, we have decided not to engage with companies where the sponsor is not the global CEO, because it doesn't succeed if it's kind of a tick-the-box kind of exercise. It only succeeds, those programs only succeed if really the mandate is coming from the top. Because if it was innate and natural, we wouldn't need this conference. You know, we would already have gender diversity and diverse leadership in every aspect. But it's not, because unconscious bias, if you're human, you have unconscious bias. But it can be trained, it can be learned. We have to kind of fight our natural tendencies. And the commitment from organizational standpoint absolutely has to come from the very top. Otherwise,
that's what we have found over the years that I've been participating in the Women's Forum. The most successful best practice has been the CEO or the chairman who sits on one of these chairs and says, when I come in, I have mandated that X, Y, and Z occur in diversity and inclusion, and anyone who is not on board is not a part of this company. That has been the most successful best practice because the team now knows how serious diversity and inclusion is. So Emmanuel, I'm going to come to you. We're talking about best practices, but one of those best practices has to include including men in the conversation. So how do men support women in the efforts of diversity and inclusion, but still maintain your own identity? We need you, but we get you. How's that?
It's a difficult question. I think actually what Alicia and Fionn said made me think that, and I think we talked about it earlier this afternoon as well. One of the first things, it sounds simple, but I came to realize that maybe it's not that self-evident, is that as men, we could first start to encourage and support all women around us. And by all women, I mean colleagues, employees, wife, sister, partner, and tell them, you can do it, you can do at least as well as a man, and in my own experience, most often even better than a man. And frankly, until recently, it seemed evident to me, and I didn't think that this type of support or encouragement were needed. But hearing us talk about that this afternoon, it reminded me a number of situations in my firm where I had younger female lawyer coming to me and saying, look, I'm thinking of leaving the firm because I don't think I can make it. I don't think I can compete in that environment. I'm not good enough, and I'll probably never become a partner in that firm. And I was like, what are you talking about? And each time I was like, of course you can become a partner. Of course you're excellent. And I came to realize that maybe that support is something that women need in the business environment, not only for men, and which they probably do not receive. And I was not giving that type of support before I had this example. But by the way, very much as well from women, which who in most cases do not that type of support. So that's something very simple. I don't think it infringes on our identity. But if we were to start from that would probably be a first step.
As well as being advocates in the room where we're not. That is something that I learned a long time ago, the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. Women need men sponsors also, so that at those tables where we have, quote, not been invited to yet, there's someone in the room that represents that it would be a good idea to get some more women in that room. Shireen, has that been your experience?
Oh, no, absolutely. If you don't have somebody who believes in you, and generally, the business world is still controlled by men, you won't be invited in. I mean, it's just the way it is. So absolutely, you need that sponsor. I think that the mentoring program, depending on the culture, because some cultures, they find it very challenging if you have a one-on-one mentoring program and you have a male-female, involved. I have suggested to some of the groups that, perhaps you could do 3 women and 1 man if that was really a problem. But clearly, having a sponsor, and even if you're starting out, you need somebody within the organization that you can relate to who's higher up, even if it's just 1 or 2 ranks, just to guide you and give you a little bit, because the problem is that when you leave college or when you leave school and you enter the workforce, it's completely different. You don't have your teachers. You don't have somebody that you can go back to and say, is this all right? And if you have a tyrant of a boss, you're certainly not going to ask them and say, is this okay the way that I've done it? So absolutely, sponsorship is very, very important for anyone joining an organization.
Alicia?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Emmanuel was saying about his own experience of female younger colleague kind of being surprised that she didn't see the same kind of opportunity. I think that's a phenomenon which I often kind of refer to as fish can't see water. I think if you're a man in a man's world, you can't see what a minority group of any sort experiences in that environment. And so I think that's why it's so important that men are involved. That men become more aware as some of these obstacles that women face that they don't even think about. All the things that you just mentioned, Shireen. Yeah, I mean, those are the things that probably men, you don't wake up in the morning and say, am I going to be sexually harassed from my mentor kind of thing. But for women, it is an issue, So we need more awareness. We need more training. We need enlightened male and female leaders that really fight our own biases and unconscious biases.
Fionn, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking about your comment earlier about the men talking about wanting to have a family and women saying the same thing. I had personal experience with giving a raise to a woman that was on maternity for 6 months, and she herself was shocked. I'm saying that, hey, why did you give me a raise? Because I was on maternity for 6 months. So I was also thinking in the same way, women kind of also felt maybe with a lack of confidence or for reasons of they think that, oh, maybe I don't deserve that increment. So it's double-edged in that sense as well, that, hey, I think having women in leadership definitely help because it brings a level of advocacy for other women to say that, you on maternity leave is your entitlement and you're still entitled to your raise.
Does the panel agree with the premise that unless you have C-suite and CEO or board buy-in, to a D&I strategy internally and externally, it won't work.
Absolutely. It won't work.
And if we know that, what are some of the best practices that any of you, and please feel free to jump in, have seen that has made a company successful in actually putting that into place? Does anyone want to comment on that? I guess, Shereen, you probably had the most experience, right?
Well, I don't know, but I think that, again, if it is toned from the top, and if you can't even get women on your boards, which is quite a simple exercise in my mind, you can't even start to have a proper inclusive culture within the entire organization,
Right.
or not even start to have fair pay or any of those things. I mean, I was just thinking about when I first started work, so this would be 30 plus years ago. I remember I was interviewed by a very old British firm. And I remember the first thing that the chairman said to me, he said, well, how many children do you think that you're thinking of having? And I said, 12. So, I didn't get the job. But, in this day and age, nobody would dare ask that question.
No.
But, so we have progressed. And we do have, I'm the first woman chairman of the stock exchange in Malaysia. Never before.
Bravo.
So, we are moving. We are moving. And I know that, there are various stock exchanges now who have women. I think NASDAQ has a female
Absolutely.
president. So there are changes. And then the onus is on us. Those who are in these positions, we must help.
Right.
We must make change because we can. And again, if the chair says to the board, why is there no female in a senior role except for HR and legal, which is generally where they always are, why don't we have a risk officer who's a female? Because actually, we are actually more risk averse. So having somebody who has that balance might be a good thing. So when you have people in those positions who are able to start dictating or questioning or asking, I think we will see change.
Absolutely.
But that's what we need.
I'm going to ask you all to close on your top piece of advice. Put you all on the spot that you would give those in our audience today for them to actually begin to reshape their own individual organizations in the area of diversity and inclusion and affect broad-scale change. What is a tangible thing that can be done? Alicia, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll speak from kind of organization standpoint first, and then from individual standpoint. So from organization standpoint, think of it as a risk management. For every critical C-suite role, you want to have choices and options of leadership and succession. And so you need to have a robust process in place so that your business is not at risk. So it is an imperative business matter, not nice to do matter. And make sure when you do that, you hardwire diversity and inclusion in mind. So that would be from an organizational leaders, what I'm going to ask you to do. From an individual standpoint, for all the people here, you need to really own your own development and own career. As Shireen mentioned, teacher's not here, nobody's going to take care of you. You have to do that yourself and be really honest about what development you need. Not all women are going to move up to the top. Do you have what it takes? Do you have a personal commitment? Do you are you really committed to making it work? So if you do, then make sure you take a very conscious decisions to develop yourself, whether it's moving internationally or taking a really challenging role, to make sure you rise to the top, because you can do it.
Thank you very much. Fionn, I'll move to you.
Yeah, I would say that diversity definitely starts from top, and companies are just, at the end of the day, is profit-oriented, and having a diverse teams does result in better performance. And we all know that. So having that consciousness, I do see that a lot of companies are beginning to realize the importance of having a diverse leadership team. So that will be what companies are beginning to do, and I see lots of companies having greater awareness at that level. At that individual level, like what Alicia had mentioned, having that growth mindset is absolutely critical for all the women in this room. And apart from that, I would say find advocates, find mentors, sponsors that will be there for you. Because like what you said earlier, Star, most of the decisions when it's made is most likely when you're not in a room. So it'll be great to have people that are your advocates.
In that room. Emmanuel?
Actually, I completely agree with Fernanda. That what I was about to say. I think that that's really the conclusion of our panel today. We started by looking at mobility and inclusion as a way to resolve the talent puzzle and to fill the gaps. And I think we realized at the end of our discussion that mobility and inclusion should be promoted per se, not to fill the gaps in the workforce of the company, but just because it benefits to the culture of the company and the performance of a company. So promoting mobility and inclusion per se as an economic tool to make the company grow bigger, grow stronger, and not as a reaction to other problems that could arise.
Excellent. And Shireen?
Okay. I think on a broader scale, my view is that we're living in a world with many companies or countries that have no leadership. And the way that you will bring about change, and change with a conscience, is having your companies be in groups like this where you can work together. It is the power of change when you work together. And if I can encourage all of you from different backgrounds and different groups, use this time, because women are hopeless at networking, but use this time, network, get to know each other, and see how you can bring about change. Because that's the way that we're going to make it happen.
100%. I'd like to thank the panel for your insights and your overview. I'd like to take a point of personal privilege and say that my one piece of advice is when you are privileged enough to have a seat at the table, remember to move over a bit and make room for someone else at that table. You can be the first, but you should never be the last or the only. Thank you all very much.